everyone, and welcome on into the GSMC Football Podcast. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We're brought to you today once again by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you once again today. We'll be covering our ongoing series of the season outlooks. Today we'll be covering the Baltimore Ravens and talking about what they could potentially do in the offseason, whether that be free agency or draft picks. And then in our second segment of the day, we're going to be talking about the report that came out today from the NFL Players Association. It was the third annual report card for each and every one of the NFL franchises as voted on by over 1,600 NFL players. So we'll be digging into that a little bit and trying to find out some interesting information that we found out from that report card. So make sure you stick around for later in the show. I'm going to be giving you my record prediction for the Baltimore Ravens, just like we do for every one of our season outlooks. And so definitely stick around for that. But before we do start, I would like to ask that you guys go ahead and like and follow the show. We do get a number of questions from you guys, within the show. And if you want to get your question answered, just go to the link at gsmcpodcast.net, and I ask that you use that for the tips and donations, and that'll get any of your questions answered. It'll put your question right to the top of the list so that I see it, and it also really, really helps the show. So once again, the link is gsmcpodcast.net. If you have any questions, comments, or anything, you want to hear your voice or have your voice be heard, then definitely go ahead and do that, and then we'll get to your questions as soon as we possibly can. So let's go ahead and get into our first segment here. We're going to be talking about the Baltimore Ravens and basically what their season outlook could potentially be. In the offseason, we basically like to go through all of the potential draft picks that they could have, any free agents that they could potentially get. If you take a look at what the Ravens did this past year, their season ended in the divisional round in Buffalo against the Bills, when they lost that game in heartbreaking fashion when Mark Andrews was unable to come up with a 2-point conversion catch, and that basically ended the game and, of course, their season. So definitely a hard way to end your year, especially with as good of a year as the Ravens ended up having. So if you take a look at some of the things that they might need, a lot of reporters from Baltimore have kind of talked about, left tackle being a priority for the Ravens this offseason. You have Ronnie Stanley there, but he is an aging veteran who's coming off of a lot of injuries in his past. So you have to wonder, are you going to re-sign a guy like that? Because he is a free agent, so he could end up going somewhere else. But if you're trying to go after potentially maybe a day 2, day 3 pick as far as left tackle, you might want to keep a guy like Ronnie Stanley available, because he will be your starter. He's still solid enough to be a starter, and the guy that you pick up could learn from a guy that's sure to be a Hall of Famer at the end of his career. He's been that good over the course of his career. So that's definitely an option. There's a couple free agents they could maybe go after if they don't go the new NFL draft route. There's Garrett Bowles from Denver. He is a free agent as well. That's a guy that they could potentially bring in. He's been solid for Denver. He's about 30 years old right now, so he's still got a few years left in the tank. So that could be something that they look into. Alaric Jackson's been another name that's been brought up several times for the Ravens. He's coming from the Rams. He is also a free agent. And also, if you're looking for like a depth piece on that offensive line at left tackle, maybe consider going after a guy like Dan Moore from Pittsburgh, because he's a free agent. He's not going to be your starter, but especially if you have Ronnie Stanley still and you don't decide to go after a left tackle in the draft, Ronnie Stanley, of course, is going to be your starter, but you still have Dan Moore there, and he could come in if Ronnie Stanley gets hurt, and Ronnie Stanley has had an injury history, so it's definitely paramount that they get some depth behind whoever it is they pick up, whether that be Ronnie Stanley or a guy like Garrett Bowles or, Alaric Jackson. You want to get somebody behind them. You got to add depth in case there's injuries. That's always a key. If you take a look on the rest of the offense is pretty much set. I think they could probably go after a receiver possibly. but maybe they could get somebody in free agency for receiver, because right now they've got Zay Flowers, who's obviously a really, really good receiver, has turned in to be a really good Ravens receiver, which we don't really say a lot because the Ravens don't typically go after receivers like in the draft or anything. That's usually always where they're lacking on offense, is at wide receiver. They tried to bring in a couple guys this past season. They tried to bring in a guy like Deontay Johnson, but Deontay Johnson, he's got a lot more issues. So that didn't really work out. He didn't really even do much with them at all. Was a non-factor, so that didn't really work out. So they could maybe get somebody in free agency. A guy like Darius Slayton comes to mind. Probably wouldn't cost a ton, and he could be like your number 2, number 3 receiver, just to add a little bit of depth to that wide receiver room. So that's something that they could possibly consider. Obviously Lamar Jackson, MVP type quarterback. He had an MVP level year last year again. He could have potentially won back-to-back MVPs if not for Josh Allen. Josh Allen ended up winning the MVP, but Lamar Jackson arguably had better numbers than Josh Allen. And there's been a lot of talk that maybe Josh Allen got the MVP award just simply because Lamar Jackson's already won it twice. So they wanted to give it to Lamar Jackson, or not Lamar Jackson, they wanted to give it to Josh Allen, just simply because of that. Now, it's not to say Josh Allen didn't deserve it. He had a really, really good year as well. And we'll get further into, what the Buffalo Bills did when we cover them in a few weeks or days, but Lamar Jackson is still right there as one of the best, maybe 2-3 quarterbacks in the league. Definitely one of the best 2 quarterbacks in the AFC. With Patrick Mahomes, I think it goes Patrick Mahomes and then Lamar Jackson after that, and then of course Josh Allen or Joe Burrow. You can interchange either one of those guys because they're both MVP type quarterbacks. All of them are. So Lamar Jackson, as long as they have him, they're going to be a threat to win a lot of games. And now with the addition of Derrick Henry that they had this past offseason, you saw how dynamic he made their offense, because it wasn't just about containing Lamar Jackson, which some teams have been good at doing when it was just Lamar Jackson you had to worry about. But now it's Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry. Both guys can kill you running the ball. So Derrick Henry ended up having about 1,900 yards rushing this past year, very close to 2,000. And the only guy that was better than him was the guy that won Offensive Player of the Year in Saquon Barkley. So Derrick Henry, he is a punishing running back. He's one of those running backs where you think you have him, hemmed in or locked down for most of the game, and then just all of a sudden he just hits you for a 90-yard touchdown or something like that, and then the floodgates open. That's just the type of running back he is. If he gets ahead of steam past that offensive line, if he gets past that first level of defense, there's virtually no way you're stopping him, because he's just a freight train when he's running at full speed. And there's not a lot of guys in the NFL that can take down Derrick Henry on a one-on-one matchup. So their offense is pretty set for the most part, apart from that offensive line issue, which is kind of a little bit of a small issue, because Ronnie Stanley is still very, very good. If they decide to go back to him, it's not going to just completely damage their offensive line. They'll still be good, and they were number 1 in the league rushing this year. So obviously he had a really good impact on that offensive line, and he probably will if they decide to re-sign him, So definitely something to look forward to there. When you take a look at what they might do in free agency, the only thing that really kind of is sort of a drawback on what they might do is the fact that they only have about $6 million in cap space right now. And there are a couple of issues that they need to address as far as restricted free agent tenders and stuff like that could potentially put them over the cap. So then that was going to lead to them potentially having restructures, or maybe even cutting a couple guys just to get cap compliant and maybe get a couple of extra dollars in there to sign some free agents, or of course, draft picks and stuff like that. Since the salary cap increased the other day when Roger Goodell decided to increase the salary cap, that definitely helped a lot of teams like Baltimore, who are kind of like right on that edge of either being over the cap or being just under the cap. So with that addition to the salary cap, that definitely gives them a little bit more options, a little bit more room to work with. So it's definitely helpful for them. You take a look at what I believe they might do this year. As far as record-wise, last year, of course, they won the division, were largely very good most of the year. You know, they had those 2 hiccups in the early season, once against the Chiefs, which is not anything to be embarrassed about. The Chiefs beat a lot of people last year. They were 15-1, I believe it was, or 14-2, or 15-2 actually. Yeah, so that's obviously not a loss that you really want to hang your head on too much. You know, it was a close game. They just lost a close game. But that game the following week against the Raiders, that was a bad one. It was a really bad loss, you know. And they had a couple other bad losses. They had one against the Browns in Cleveland, which was unexpected because the Browns did not have a good year last year. So that was a tough one. They lost a game against Pittsburgh in Pittsburgh, which was a game that you felt like they could have won. You know, they were right there because the Steelers offense didn't really do anything that entire game, but they just weren't really able to get over that hump. Of course, they smacked the Steelers when they played them again later in the year, but it's just an example of just they have these types of losses sometimes. Like you would call it like a typical Ravens loss, you know, where they'll have really, really good teams and, you know, will be playing really, really well, blowing other teams out. And then all of a sudden you get a game like, which has happened a lot against Pittsburgh, you know, where they've had a lot of games in which they've had better teams than Pittsburgh, but they for some reason, they just struggle. And Lamar Jackson has struggled. He didn't really struggle too much in the final 2 games that they played Pittsburgh, but he's had a history of not playing very well against them or just in big games in general. He's typically been known as a guy that doesn't really win a ton of playoff games. He can have a really, really good regular season, but once we get to the playoffs, that's when he usually does not play that well. It hasn't really been the case the past couple of years. He's been pretty solid in the playoffs, good enough for them to win. You know, it's just been several little things that, you know, ultimately ended up in having them lose those games. You know, whether it be a couple of bad turnovers from Lamar, you know, it's pretty tough. Even that game against the Bills, he had a couple early turnovers, and if not for those, maybe they win that game. He did end up coming back and having a really good game in that second half, and they still really should have won that game despite that. But you know, that's just kind of what Lamar's been known for, unfortunately. And until he shakes that, he's always going to be known as that guy that can play really, really well in the regular season, but can't get over the hump in the playoffs and get to that Super Bowl. So right now, what I have them as is just 1 win better than the Bengals. I had the Bengals yesterday at 12-5. I've got the Ravens at 13-4 and winning that division. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see how everything goes. Obviously, that record could change with free agency additions, even potential maybe injuries in the preseason, as we've seen it happen before to other teams. You know, San Francisco comes to mind where they've had a ton of injuries. So things like that can happen. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. But, you know, they're still pretty solid for the most part. So I still think they're going to be a division winner for the 2nd year in a row. So we'll have to see how everything works out with them. But that covers it for the Baltimore Ravens. So when we come back, we're going to be talking about the NFLPA coming out with their report cards for each one of the franchises in the NFL. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about how that affects any teams, if at all, but we'll be getting into a little bit more in detail in our next segment. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit, I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant, I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put.
All right, guys, welcome on back to the show. Before we get into our second segment of the day, I do want to just remind you guys that if you have any questions or comments, go on to our link at gsmcpodcast.net, drop in your questions or comments, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. Obviously, with this being a pre-recorded episode, any questions or comments that you might have, drop them in the comments. I'll try to get to them on our next episode. So any type of help or support definitely is greatly appreciated. So let's go ahead and get into our second segment of the day, and we're going to be talking about the NFLPA coming out and giving us their grades for each one of the NFL franchises and their report cards. Now, the biggest jump or biggest drop that we saw, which I felt was kind of interesting, the biggest drop that we saw was the Philadelphia Eagles, which is pretty crazy considering they just won the Super Bowl. So it kind of gives you just a little bit of an inkling as to how much these report cards really mean, in my opinion. There's some grades. There's a lot of like really good teams that'll have poor grades on a lot of different areas. There are 11 different categories for those of you who are unaware. I'll go through the categories. Excuse me, I do have to read this because I couldn't remember all of them at once, But the 11 different categories, they have the treatment of families, their food, cafeteria, nutritionist and dietitian, the locker room, the training staff, weight room, strength and conditioning coaches, team travel, head coach, and then finally the owner. So those are all the different categories that you look at. This year, the number one team for the second consecutive year was the Miami Dolphins. Number two was, for also the second consecutive year, was the Minnesota Vikings. And then the bottom of our report cards were the Arizona Cardinals. They came in at dead last this year. But as far as the Dolphins being the number one team, there's been some talk about maybe they're not haven't necessarily been super competitive on the field, but when you take a look at like their facilities, and I think a lot of their positive grades have a lot to do with their location. Being in Miami, it's a vacation spot. Obviously there's the beach life, there's the nightlife, there's a lot of reasons why NFL players might say that the Miami Dolphins is a good place to be at just because of the location in general. You're right there in a vacation spot, where there's been several Super Bowls that have been held there. There's been a lot of big events that have been held there. So I think that does have at least a little bit to do with how good their rankings are. The Minnesota Vikings coming in at number 2 for the second straight season kind of just goes on the back of, if you take a look at the Vikings, they're another situation in which they're not necessarily ever really bad on the field, but they've had seasons where they've been somewhat mediocre. But, lately they've been a really, really good team. They've got great coaching. They've got great ownership. They just built a brand new stadium a few years ago, so those facilities are top-notch, top of the line. So it doesn't really surprise me that they would be pretty high up on the list of teams there. Obviously, if you take a look at another interesting team that I thought was the Commanders, because the Commanders were last year, they were ranked dead last in these same report card rankings. That was when they still had Dan Snyder as the owner. Now, of course, with Josh Harris being the majority owner of the Commanders, they have jumped all the way up to number 11 in the league. They still have their facilities, their FedEx Field in Landover, Maryland. It's a stadium that needs to be probably just torn down, and they need to just rebuild a new stadium, which they, I'm sure, have plans in place. If I'm not mistaken, they do have plans in place to rebuild that stadium. Take a look at their team, too. They got a nice young core, got a young quarterback, and they've got a good coaching staff, too. Dan Quinn, ended up being really, really good for them last year. He's been to a Super Bowl before. When he was in Dallas as the defensive coordinator, they had a really good defense too. So their coaching is, much, much improved than what they've been in the past several years. Also, the Falcons are right near the top of this rankings list too. They have a really, really nice stadium, really nice facilities as well. Their coaching is not necessarily super high in the rankings. I think their rankings were about like a C or so with coaching, but they have still a lot of good things going for them. They have a lot of really good facilities. That new Mercedes-Benz Dome Stadium that they built several years ago, it's hosted a couple Super Bowls. It's hosted some SEC championship games. It's been a very, very good venue. So obviously, with being down in the South in Atlanta, it's a pretty big city too. So that goes into account, that you take factors into that. It's a sports city. There's a lot of different sports. Whether it be baseball, football, college baseball, or not college baseball, college basketball, NBA have Atlanta Hawks too. So there's a lot of intrigue to want to be in Atlanta, outside of just the football thing, which I do think you have to take that into account, much like with Miami. It's not just about, oh, this team's really good on the field. You got to think of everything else that comes with being in whatever city it is that, you're talking about. Well, it's not really surprising for me, but might be surprising for some people, is the Pittsburgh Steelers ranked 28th in the league when it comes to these rankings. Their owner, Art Rooney II, got a D ranking or D grade. Coaching is still at an A with Mike Tomlin. As much as a lot of Steeler fans may not necessarily agree with the fact that their coaching is at an A, he's still highly regarded by players. And that's really where these rankings come from. These are not rankings based on reporters, who might want him gone or something like that. These are strictly from the player's perspective that are voting on this. And he is still considered a very, very good head coach, and players really, really love playing for him. So obviously he has an A, but they have a lot of issues with their locker room facilities, training facilities. They also are not great when it comes to the family dynamic thing. They're ranked relatively low. I think they're C minus, which is better than they were last year when they were ranked an F in that category. So that's, kind of a surprise. And you take a look at the rest of the bottom of the league in those rankings, it's not necessarily a surprise when I read off the teams. It's the New York Jets. Obviously, they've had their issues. The Cleveland Browns, they've had their issues. The New England Patriots, they've recently had their issues, but they're still a successful franchise. But they're in the middle of a rebuild as well. So, them being down there is not really too much of a surprise. Maybe a little bit of a surprise just because of their history. But the Raiders also are down there in terms of the bottom. The top five, of course, we talked about. The Miami Dolphins are number 1, Minnesota Vikings number 2, and to round out that top 5 were the Falcons and the Chargers and the Raiders. It's actually the Cardinals that were dead last, not the Raiders, so my mistake there. But the Raiders, Chargers, Dolphins, Vikings, Falcons, all of those are in the top 5. Bottom 5, Jets, Browns, Pats, Cardinals, and, of course, the Steelers are down there as well. So Falcons and Chargers were both in the bottom 5 last year, and they are now in the top 5. So quite a turnaround for them. Like I mentioned before, the Philadelphia Eagles had one of the biggest drop-offs. They're ranked pretty close to the bottom, not quite on the top, or not quite on the bottom 5, but they are pretty close to the bottom, which, that kind of brings me into my next point. I don't really believe that these rankings or these grades really reflect the teams truly. If you take a look at what the teams do on the field, that's really what matters the most. When it comes down to it, that's the bottom line, is, are you successful on the field? And even last year, the Kansas City Chiefs, who had just come off of winning a Super Bowl, they were ranked near the bottom of the league in these same report cards. So you take it with a grain of salt, I believe. Sure, there are some, concerns in some of the grades, and some of them are valid concerns, but I don't really think it plays too much of a factor into how teams perform on the field. I really don't. Even though you got teams like the Steelers that are ranked pretty low in their facilities and things like that, they still have good facilities. It's not like they're walking into a dump or anything. They still have good facilities. It's just, for some reason, they're ranked low, and it happens to a lot of good teams. Not saying the Steelers are a good team, but it happens to a lot of more successful teams. They get ranked kind of to the bottom of these types of lists. Now, this is only the third list that they've come out with. This is the third annual report card, so there's not a whole lot of history to go on in terms of that. But I just believe that you shouldn't look too much into it, really. This doesn't necessarily affect how a team really kind of progresses in the season, if I could say that. I just don't believe that it's not, I don't believe that it is something that really should be thought about too much. Maybe the players think about it a little bit more than the average fan or a reporter or something like that, but ultimately it's about wins and losses, and that's what it comes down to. And these other little things here, ownership, obviously it's never a good look when your owner is ranked pretty low, but there have been plenty of really good owners that have been ranked really low. The Chiefs owner, of course, was ranked really low the year they won the Super Bowl. And Art Rooney II for Pittsburgh, he's ranked as a D, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's accurate. He's still a good owner. If you take a look at the whole of the NFL, I think most people would probably say that ownership in Pittsburgh is still amongst one of the best in the league. Sure, they've made some questionable decisions over the past few years, but nothing that you could really say that, this team is going to end up being, dead last in the league now because their owner doesn't know what he's doing, or something like that. I just don't see these report cards really affecting too much. It's just something to talk about. It's another story to talk about in the NFL at a kind of a dead time in the NFL right now. Sure, you've got the scouting combine coming up, which starts tomorrow in terms of the drills and stuff like that, but this is just that time of year where it's just not really, there's not really much to report on. So they come out with these report cards, and it gives people something to talk about. That's ultimately, I don't mean to sound blunt, but that's just kind of what I feel like these report cards are about. It just gives people an additional thing to talk about. I don't think it really has much bearing on what a team does from day to day or how they run their organization. I totally understand why Dan Snyder and the Commanders were dead last, though. So there is some truth to this, when you take a look at last year's rankings with Dan Snyder. But there is a little bit of truth to that. Some of the things are a little concerning. But for the most part, I don't think doesn't really have any bearing on how a team performs in any given season. So still is an interesting thing to talk about, interesting thing to really think about with everything going on and leading up to this upcoming season. Which teams are considered the best and which teams are considered the worst. So it's just an interesting topic to talk about, but don't think it really has much bearing, like I said. But yeah, so those were the report cards that came out today. If you want to go on and go into more depth and look on for yourself, I found a couple of different websites online, where I found some of the report cards. If you want to go through each and every one of the report cards, definitely do that. And if you have any questions or comments about that, definitely, jot them down, and we'll try and address them on our next show. But for now, that is just about it for everything that I have for you guys today. I hope you guys really enjoyed the show. Once again, I just want to remind you guys, if you do want to contribute to the show in any way, whether that be tips and donations or just a comment or a question, go on to the gsmcpodcast.net link and we will answer your question as soon as we can. With this being pre-recorded, like I've said before, we won't get to these questions obviously today because it's not a live stream, but if you jot those questions down, we'll get to them in our next episode. So I do appreciate everybody for sticking around and hanging out and listening to this. So I will be back tomorrow with another episode, and we're going to be continuing our series of season outlooks, and maybe we'll have a couple of other little stories here and there to talk about. So we're looking forward to that, and I look forward to hearing from anybody that wants to comment or send a question in. So I appreciate everybody, helping out and supporting the show, and I will talk to you guys next time we are on tomorrow. So thanks once again from the GSMC Football Podcast. My name is Matthew Quinn, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful night.